Lesson 21, Section 5. The Compromise of 1850 fails. Henry Clay and Daniel Webster hoped the Compromise of 1850 would quiet the slavery controversy for years to come. In fact, it satisfied almost no one, and the debate grew louder each year. The Fugitive Slave Act. People in the North and the South were unhappy with the Fugitive Slave Act, though for different reasons. Northerners did not want to enforce the act, whereas Southerners felt the act did not do enough to ensure the return of their escaped property. Ensure means to make sure or certain. Under the Fugitive Slave Act, a person arrested as a runaway slave had almost no legal rights. Many runaways fled all the way to Canada rather than risk being caught and sent back to their owners. Others decided to stand and fight. Reverend Jermaine Logan, a former slave living in New York, said boldly, "I don't respect this law. I don't fear it. I won't obey it. I will not live as a slave. And if force is employed to re-enslave me, I shall make preparations to meet the crisis as becomes a man." The Fugitive Slave Act also said that any person who helped a slave escape, or even refused to aid slave catchers, could be jailed. This provision, people complain, would force many Northerners to become slave catchers. Opposition to the act was widespread in the North. When slave catchers came to Boston, they were hounded by crowds of angry citizens shouting, "Slave hunters! There go the slave hunters!" After a few days of this treatment, most slave catchers decided to leave. Northerners' refusal to support the act infuriated slaveholders, and it also made enforcement of the act almost impossible. Of the tens of thousands of fugitives living in the North during the 1850s, only about 300 were captured and returned to their owners during this time. Uncle Tom's Cabin. Nothing brought the horrors of slavery home to Northerners more than Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe. The novel grew out of a vision Stowe had while sitting in church on a wintry Sunday morning in 1851. The vision began with a saintly slave known as Uncle Tom and his cruel master, Simon Legree, who in a furious rage had the old slave whipped to death. Just before Uncle Tom's soul slipped out of his body, he opened his eyes and whispered to Legree, "Ye poor miserable critter, there ain't no more ye can do. I forgive ye with all my soul." Racing home, Stowe scribbled down what she had imagined. Her vision of Uncle Tom's death became part of a much longer story that was first published in installments in an abolitionist newspaper. In one issue, readers held their breath as the slave Eliza chose to risk death rather than be sold away from her young son. Chased by slave hunters and their dogs, Eliza dashed to freedom across the ice-choked Ohio River, clutching her child in her arms. In a later issue, Stowe's readers wept as they read her account of how the character of Uncle Tom died at the hands of Simon Legree. In 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin was published as a novel. Plays based on the book toured the country, thrilling audiences with Eliza's dramatic escape to freedom. No other work had ever aroused such powerful emotions about slavery. In the South, the novel and its author were scorned and cursed. However, in the North, Uncle Tom's Cabin made millions of people even angrier about the cruelties of slavery. The Austin Manifesto and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Northerners who were already horrified by slavery were roused to fury by two events in 1854: the publication of the so-called Austin Manifesto and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The document known as the Austin Manifesto was a message sent to the Secretary of State by three American diplomats who were meeting in Ostend, Belgium. President Franklin Pierce, who had taken office in 1853, had been trying to purchase the island of Cuba from Spain, but Spain had refused the offer. The message from the diplomats urged the U.S. government to seize Cuba by force if Spain continued to refuse to sell the island. When the message was leaked to the public, angry Northerners charged that Pierce administration wanted to buy Cuba, in order to add another slave state to the Union. Early that same year, Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois introduced a bill in Congress that sparked an uproar. Douglas wanted to get a railroad built to California. He thought the project was more likely to happen if Congress organized the Great Plains into the Nebraska Territory and opened the region to settlers. This territory lay north of the Missouri Compromise, and Douglas's bill said nothing about slavery. But Southerners in Congress agreed to support the bill only if Douglas made a few changes, and those changes had far-reaching consequences. Douglas's final version of the bill, known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act, was passed in 1854 and created two new territories, Kansas and Nebraska. It also abolished the Missouri Compromise by leaving it up to the settlers themselves to vote on whether to permit slavery in the two territories. Douglas called this policy popular sovereignty, or rule by the people. The Kansas-Nebraska Act hit the North like a thunderbolt. Once again, Northerners were haunted by visions of slavery marching across the plains. Douglas tried to calm their fears by saying that the climates of Kansas and Nebraska were not suited to slave labor. But when Northerners studied maps, they were not so sure. Newspaper editor Horace Greeley charged in the New York Tribune, "The pretense of Douglas and Co. that not even Kansas is to be made a slave state by his bill is a gag or a joke. Ask any Missourian what he thinks about it. The Kansas Territory is bounded in its entire length by Missouri, with a whole tier of slave counties leaning against it. Won't be a slave state? Gentlemen, don't lie any more." Bloodshed in Kansas. After the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed in 1854, settlers poured into Kansas. Most were peaceful farmers looking for good farmland, but some settlers moved to Kansas either to support or to oppose slavery. In the South, towns sent their young men to Kansas, and in the North, abolitionists raised money to send weapons to anti-slavery settlers. Before long, Kansas had two competing governments in the territory, one for slavery and one against it. The struggle over slavery soon turned violent. On May 21st, 1856, pro-slavery settlers and so-called border ruffians from Missouri invaded Lawrence, Kansas, the home of the anti-slavery government. Armed invaders burned a hotel, looted several homes, and tossed the printing press of an abolitionist newspaper into the Kaw River. As the invaders left Lawrence, one of them boasted, "Gentlemen, this is the happiest day of my life." The raid on Lawrence provoked a wave of outrage in the North. People raised money to replace the destroyed presses, and more free soilers, as anti-slavery settlers were called, prepared to move to Kansas. Meanwhile, a fiery abolitionist named John Brown plotted his own revenge. Days after the Lawrence raid, Brown and 7 followers, including 4 of Brown's sons and his son-in-law, invaded the pro-slavery town of Pottawatomie, Kansas. There, they dragged 5 men they suspected of supporting slavery from their homes and hacked them to death with swords. Violence in Congress. The violence in Kansas greatly disturbed Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts. To Sumner, it was proof of what he had long suspected, that Senator Stephen Douglas had plotted with Southerners to make Kansas a slave state. In 1856, Sumner voiced his suspicions in a passionate speech called "The Crime Against Kansas." In harsh, shocking language, Sumner described the crime against Kansas as a violent assault on an innocent territory, compelling it to the hateful embrace of slavery. He dismissed Douglas as a noisome or offensive, squat, and nameless animal. Sumner also heaped abuse on many Southerners, including Senator Andrew P. Butler of South Carolina. Just what Sumner hoped to accomplish was not clear. However, copies of his speech were quickly printed up for distribution in the North. After reading it, New England poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow congratulated Sumner on the brave and noble speech you made, never to die out in the memories of men. Certainly, it was not about to die out in the memories of enraged Southerners. 2 days after the speech, a relative of Senator Butler, South Carolina Representative Preston Brooks, attacked Sumner in the Senate, beating him with his metal-tipped cane until it broke in half. By the time other senators could pull Brooks away, Sumner had collapsed, bloody and unconscious. Reactions to the attack on Sumner showed how divided the country had become. Many Southerners applauded Brooks for defending the honor of his family and the South. From across the South, supporters sent Brooks new canes to replace the one he had broken on Sumner's head. Most Northerners viewed the beating as another example of Southern brutality. One Connecticut student was so upset that she wrote to Sumner about going to war. "I don't think it is of very much use to stay any longer in the high school," she wrote. "The boys would be better learning to hold muskets, and the girls to make bullets."